Well, I thought we might begin with some premises, some of which were sort of predictions in the last pod. One in particular was I think I had mentioned that COVID-19, I thought of it as a military defeat for the US. And the reason I thought of it as such is because literally billions of dollars had been allocated for biodefense over a span of about 20 years since the anthrax episode in 2001 and during SARS and Ebola. All of these sort of scares happened, and so in the U.S. in 2018, it announced they had a national biodefense policy that was supposed to combat man-made and natural threats. And so there's an expectation that of the WMDs, nuclear, biological, and chemical, that the U.S. military would have some trick up its sleeve, just like out of the movies where hard men would come in America's time of need and step in with some, magic thing. And that totally didn't happen. And when that didn't happen, that's why I said, COVID-19 was a military defeat, even if it wasn't being presented that way to the American public. A big piece of the military industrial complex, or the military, whatever you want to call it, was like cardboard. It was like a Potemkin village, just kind of just fell over with a push. And people kind of argued with me about this, and they said, no, because it was right on the border of what you would think of as military or not, right? Since most of the folks who had been talked about publicly were the CDC and the FDA and the civilian agencies, but certainly billions had been allocated for biodefense. And it was borderline. You could argue it wasn't military. You could argue I was off base there, that the military was actually highly competent. But then one thing that happened, 6 months-ish later after our podcast, was the whole Afghanistan thing. And so now you had something where, the U.S. military had 20 years and $2 trillion and total air superiority and total surveillance and a local government that they had set up and a military that they had trained, local military that they had trained and handpicked and equipped, and even a timeline that they had negotiated with the Taliban, which it had, for the most part, adhered to in terms of its terms. It hadn't fired on American troops during that process. I think it adhered to its side of it. And those are advantages that you normally don't get in a military conflict. Folks with that level of advantage, it's like a huge handicap in golf, right? And there's that saying, right, with military things, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And the withdrawal showed that the U.S. military is no longer really that amazing at logistics. Also, the president and the Secretary of State, Blinken said something like, the collapse won't happen from a Friday to a Monday. And it basically did. It was like a Monday to a Wednesday or something like that. I forget the exact dates, but it happened just over a few days. And, Biden said there's not going to be a scene that's like the helicopter evacuation in Vietnam, and there was. And the thing is, there's no way that I'm not, by the way, saying, it's not a political comment, really. It's basically about the decline of state capacity over the last 20 or 30 years. In many ways, in 1991, the U.S. was the hyperpower. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was a hyperpower, as the French put it, that could win everywhere without fighting. And in many ways, the combination of administrations over the last 30-ish years have blown maybe the biggest lead in human history. Now it, rather than winning everywhere without fighting, it fights everywhere without winning. So the Afghanistan thing, I think, was sort of, I hate to call it a vindication, because it's a very unfortunate thing, especially for the Afghans, who are now subject to this medieval regime. But I think that is something which also has important ripple effects. It kind of flips over a card, and you kind of think there's something that's 70% probability, and then it goes to 100% probability. And then you think about what the consequences of that are. So that's like one, I think, quote, prediction or something that came true, or piece of a world model that was vindicated. Let me pause there and get your thoughts.